So from my very basic understanding of Thai law is foreigners are not permitted to outright own landed property in Thailand, right? But they can do something called leasing, right? So can you talk about the process that a foreigner can do to go into acquire landed property in Thailand?
Yes. The first step in the process is the property due diligence, and that involves a review of the land office file. Kunmana can maybe elaborate on that. That then also the contract review and international funds transfer, tax matters, consultation in general. There's usually a lot of questions that come up during the transaction that the client asks his or her lawyer, and then obviously the registrations at the land office, at the land department, the ownership transfer or lease registration or other registrations like this.
Now, generally, this process that you just outlined here, and we'll go into that in more detail, is this process the same across different holiday markets? Let's say I ask you about Phuket versus Hua Hin or Pattaya or even a house in Bangkok. Is this process basically the same?
Yeah, that's basically the same process.
Okay, so let's go through the first one is property due diligence, right? So let's say, for example, I'm looking at a beautiful beachfront property in Phuket right now, and I've come to you and I say that I'm really interested in this property. So what are the processes? What are the steps that I need to do in order to be an owner of this property?
So the first step of the property due diligence is first of all we attend the land office to verify what kind of the land title document, whether this is the Chonot title deed or the Noso Samko or in English certificates of utilization. And then we review the file, we check the history of the land plot, what kind of the first land title document have been issued. So is that we can identify claim certificates and reviews the how many subdivision of the land, reviews the how many transactions or how many the buyer has been recorded backside of the title deed on the land plot. And we reviews the encumbrance, whether the land plot subject to any encumbrance or not. For example, like mortgage registration, service to registration, sale with the right of redemption, or Thai people know as a khai phak. Or another thing that what we reviews like the legal proceeding. Whether is there any legal proceeding pendings or official note in case of the seller gets filed the lawsuit and or in case of the seller bankruptcy. So we can identify the official note on that, which will affect the ownership transfer or will suspend the registration of the ownership transfer. And another topic what we do for the due diligence is we site visit the land plot. We will make sure that the land plot is connect with the access lot. We connect the site visit and we compare with the map sheets of the land office. Make sure that the legal access lot is well connected with the public laws. And
so just to summarize, so part of the property due diligence is making sure that it is the correct title deed, right? And then the history of transfers and ownerships, whether there's any form of current leasings or past leases. And then also you're surveying the land itself to see if it's close to any public roads. Okay, so what would be the name of the title deed that is eligible for a foreigner to lease? What is it called?
The foreigner can lease like a Chonot title deed, which is possible for the land office to register on the backside of the title deed. But even if we have to deal with the civil law discretion with the land office, there is a Chonot title deed which is possible. And another thing is the Noso Samko or the certificates of utilization, which is the eligible for register the lease terms.
Okay. Now, usually the foreigner would lease the land from a Thai individual owner. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Yes. And then you move on to what you say is so let's say the title deed checks out and you survey the land and it checks out. It meets all the qualifications that you just said there. And then you move on to the contract review.
It's not really a survey in the technical sense, but what we do is basically go through a kind of checklist with all the items that Kunmana just mentioned, and it's basically a list of potential legal defects, and we make sure that there are no legal defects related to the property. A lot of clients or investors are surprised about the level of detail that we have with this due diligence, but it's a very important part of the preparations. In Thailand, there's no notarial public system as in the Western countries, so buyers have to check themselves, right, the legalities of the property before they invest. So it's a very important part. And then the contractual due diligence, obviously, that is it's necessary to review the contracts or prepare the contracts. If the seller has not provided, or so we would either use our own templates and then prepare the contractual documentation for the transaction, and then negotiate with the opposing party. If they have concerns, we would discuss with them, perhaps change the contract a bit if it's needed to come to a deal. Or we would, if a contract is presented to our client, we would then review the contract, make comments, suggest changes, flag major issues, perhaps. Hopefully, there will be no deal breakers in the contract. But usually most of these issues can be resolved for the property due diligence as well, and with the contract. So it's just about knowing in advance about the issues and then addressing them, with the other side, and then coming to a good contract.
Okay, so we've surveyed the land. So let's say this make-believe land, beachfront property that I'm interested in. You've done a due diligence on the title deed, it checks out. There's no pending court cases on it, it checks out. And then you've surveyed the site itself, and then it's connected to the roads, like you said. And then we've presented to the seller the contract that we have. And then next we go to the transaction handling phase, yes. Right? Okay. Yes.
Well, transaction handling, basically what we mean by that is that we just guide the client through the process. We basically handle the transaction for him. We follow up with the other side. If there's no response, we make sure that the transaction is completed in a timely fashion. We take the initiative and also we take over the correspondence with the other side as well. So the client does not have to do anything.
So what are the actual logistics of me bringing money, transferring money to the seller and all like that? Could you talk about that process?
Yeah, the transfer, the international transfer of the purchase price, or the rental price is usually not complicated, but there's a certain documentation that has to be generated by the bank. That kind of documentation, we want to make sure that we have it, and also for the repatriation of the funds later on, you need to show why you brought the money into Thailand initially. So to have all that documentation complete, we assist the clients with that as well.
Okay. So based on what I heard, if I'm a foreigner and I want to purchase property in Thailand, I need to purchase it with funds that I've brought in from abroad, right? For that specific transaction, is that correct? Can I use funds that I made here from my business or from my salary at all?
There's a specific rule for condo units that you have to bring funds from overseas. For land and house, that doesn't exist. That's a provision in the Condo Act which doesn't exist in that way. But there are other rules and other requirements connected with lease registrations, and some land offices are very strict with certain documentation. So this has all needs to be done properly to make sure that the transaction goes smoothly.
Okay. Kunmana, can you talk about, so I can bring funds in, and like you said, you go through that process. What are some fees or taxes that are associated with me purchasing property?
The fee and taxes, well, always the depends on the agreement between party. Mostly the fee and tax to pay at the land office consists of the transfer fees, 2%. Mostly the seller and buyer shares 50% of it, and the rest will paid by the seller, which is the income tax and the specific business tax or the stamp duty.
Okay, so the seller pays that, not me.
Depend on the agreements.
Okay.
Yeah.
But usually, what is the standard?
Standard is the transfer fees, 50% between the seller and buyer, and the rest pays by the seller.
Mm-hmm. But then the seller would be the one to pay their own capital gains taxes, or that they gain from income from selling it.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else that we need to know in the process of purchasing? So we've done the due diligence, surveying the title deed, the property itself. We've done a contract review, sent over that, and then bringing money over, and then we talked about taxes and fees, and then what would happen in the actual transfer of the property?
That's called like ownership transfer registration, which is required under the law, under section 1299 of the Thai Civil and Commercial Code. The sales, the properties is required to registration at the land office. We usually represent the buyer, attend the land office. We prepare the power of attorney. We also prepare any necessary document required during the process. In case the buyer marry, so we prepare the consent letter with from the spouse. This compliant with the in case of any confliction with the family dispute from the land office. In case of the condominium, we the SY on the process prepares the document from the bank. Because the money have to be transferred from overseas, we recommend or SY the process with the money transfer. And we on the days of the ownership transfer, we monitor the process with the land office registration, make sure all goes smoothly. And once the land office has the complete registration, register the name of the buyer on the back side of the title deed. We check everything correct, and we exchange the cashier check with the seller, and the seller will deliver the keys and the house registration book, and we check again that the house registration book is any name of the house master and the resident.
Okay, so let's say, for example, this villa that I want to buy is 20 million baht. Do I need to transfer the money all at once, 20 million, or is it in separate batches? Usually, how does this work?
In case of money transfer, there is no law fix that the buyer have to transfer at one time, so the buyer can split that. Okay. The important thing is the buyer have to fix the objective of transfer, what purpose of the transfer is. So the bank can issue the certificate correspondent with the purpose of transfer.
Okay, and that certificate will be used later, like you said, when you want to repatriate money back. Is that correct?
Yes, at a later stage, if once you have sold the property and you would like to transfer the money back to your home country as a foreigner, then you would require the commercial banks will ask you for documentation from the initial transaction, from the initial purchase, and then you have to show a certain bank documentation. Before it was called FET form, and now this is like a less formal document, but you need to show that you have transferred these funds to Thailand and you're just transferring them out again, and you have not generated this from income in Thailand. It has something to do with tax, and that you would have to pay perhaps in Thailand, and also with money laundering laws and these kind of things.
Okay, so let's just say that this process goes very smoothly. This is a well-advertised villa from a project, from a reputable developer. There's no issues really, and the seller was very accepting of my offer, and everything went smoothly. Usually, how long does this process take? Are you able to give an answer on that?
The transaction to complete?
Yes, from the day that I come to you and say, I want to hire you as my lawyer to purchase this property, till the day that I move in.
Yes. Well, clients usually come to us already with a signed reservation agreement or something like that in their hand. So the property agent usually makes sure that this kind of documentation is signed quickly, and from there we would discuss with the client, the case, and once we are hired, we would start with the property due diligence, make an appointment, or schedule a trip or a visit to the land department, and then we would review the file and report to the client preliminarily perhaps, and then prepare a report. This takes quite a long time, a few weeks altogether until the report is complete. We make very detailed reports, but in the meantime we would start working on the contract as well, either the contract review or start drafting the contract. So also the buyer would arrange for the funds transfer. So we would work on all these things at the same time. Mm-hmm. And if the parties are very efficient, I would say 4 to 6 weeks.
4 to 6 weeks.
That can be done. But in practice, it's due to the parties that there are delays here and there, so it might take longer. But 4 to 6 weeks would be realistic if the parties are the client and the other side also are very efficient.
All right, so now let's talk about the actual legal structure of the ownership of the landed property. So you mentioned that the contract would be in the form of a lease, right? And that is typically for how long?
The lease would be for 30 years. The lease can be registered on the title deed as well, on the backside of the title deed. That means it can be registered at the land department as well. Yeah. And it also has different kind of registration fees, different rates for registration fees than the ownership transfer. The lease is limited to 30 years, which is obviously not the desired legal structure for most investors, right? But you can own the house, and you can also add to the lease agreement the certain provisions that hopefully make the investment more worthwhile for you. For example, the purchase option is very common in the contract, and it means that if the Thai law would ever change and foreigners would be permitted to own land at some point in the future, then the buyer, the lessee in this case, would have the option to transfer ownership into his name.
Is this a common clause to include?
Yeah, yes, right.
Okay.
So creative lawyers came up with this provision in the contract, and the goal is to sort of make it more attractive for the lessee, for the foreign investor, right?
Okay.
And these clauses also usually provide that you can also transfer ownership at any time, or have the owner transfer ownership to a third party, to a Thai third party, a Thai national, because of course that would be permitted as well under the law. So that's also included in the purchase option.
Okay.
And then, yeah.
Sorry, just to summarize. So when you're leasing it, you're leasing the land itself, but you as a foreigner have the ability to own the structure on it. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So let's just say that I'm purchasing a landed property with a villa. Would it be where I lease the land, but I own the house and I can renovate the house and do what I want with the house? Is this usually the case?
Yes.
Okay.
That's right. Yes.
Okay.
And land ownership and house ownership would be separated, and then this is possible.
So I can either lease a plot of land that has a house on it in which I will own, or lease an empty plot of land and then build a house in which I own. Is that also a possibility as well, right?
Yes, right.
Okay. And now, okay, so you were talking about transfer of ownership of the lease. So let's say if you in the event where the seller sells their ownership of the land, would the lease agreement still remain between you and the new owner, the new Thai owner?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and this is standard in the...
Yes.
Okay, so that's not something to worry about, really.
That's not something to worry about. What is maybe an issue or something you should be aware of is that the lease expires earlier than 30 years during the 30 years period if the lessee dies before the lease period expires. And then this is a difficult situation because there would then be no inheritance to the heirs of the lessee. So you have to agree on and add a provision to the lease agreement to that effect. That's very important. That's why you should be very careful to draft the lease agreement properly.
Okay, so let's say, for example, I've leased this landed property, and let's say, and we start a new lease for 30 years, and let's say 10 years later I pass away. Is it straightforward, provided that we draft the right contract to designate someone to inherit the lease, or will they need to renegotiate with the seller? With the owner.
They would not have to renegotiate with the owner, but straightforward is maybe not the right word, because you have to go through a legal process then in this situation. I mean, at the land office, the name of the heir has to be registered as new lessee, right? And the land office will only do that if you have gone through a sort of probate procedure in Thailand, right? I mean, you have to appoint an administrator, and the administrator will then need to do that. So it's not really straightforward, but also it can be handled. It's something that we also handle. Lawyers do that. They act as administrators, or they represent the client, the heirs, who are then administrators.
All right. So the next question is still on lease, because I keep getting a lot of questions about the lease, and they're good questions too. So if you could talk about, let's say, if I want to, can I resell this lease later? Let's say 10 years later, I want to sell this lease to another foreigner, or if another foreigner who's already had a lease for, let's say, 10 years wants to sell it to me, is this a procedure that's commonly done easily as well? Okay.
Yeah, that's also a common procedure, yes. It's called novation. So it's basically an agreement between three parties, between the owner, the lessee, the old lessee, and the new lessee. And this then has to be registered at the land office. The problem with it is that you can only transfer the remaining period of the 30 years. So what you would typically do in this situation is that you would ask the landowner to agree to register a new 30-year lease term for the new lessee.
Okay, so usually by default, it would just be a continuation of the same contract, unless the owner agrees to go into a brand new contract starting from year one.
Yes.
Okay, understood. Anything that I'm missing out that as a looking at this?
On the lease agreement, maybe we should mention also the so-called renewal option.
Okay.
This is very relevant in practice. The real estate agents often sell 90-year leases, which means that you have a 30-year lease, which is the normal period of time provided by the civil code. And then you have a renewal of 30 years and then a second renewal of another 30 years. Mm-hmm. And so this is actually a bit problematic because many people misunderstand this. There's no automatic extension of the 30-year lease term. The renewal means it's a very good clause in the contract. It's a standard clause in the contract, and we highly recommend it. It should be in every lease agreement. But you should be aware of what it means. You should not misunderstand the meaning. It's not an automatic extension up till 90 years. After 30 years, the owner and the lessee need to go to the land office again, register another 30-year lease term, and they both have to agree to it. And 30 years is a long time. It might be different people, mm-hmm. right? Or if it's a company, the company might not exist anymore. It's not guaranteed, right? I mean, the cooperation of the owner is not guaranteed. Even right. It's not. He might not honor the agreement, right? So this is something that we would like to point out. The third 30-year lease term is even more problematic because it's a longer period of time, even longer, and you have in this civil code no provision that more than one renewal is actually permitted. So I would not assume that the renewal option gives you 90 years. The first 30 years are safe. The second 30 years, if everything goes well with the renewal at the land office, the third 30 years is not guaranteed.
Right. So you should not assume that based on the marketing, whatever they show you, that it's a guaranteed 90 years.
Yes.
So you need to, okay. So I don't know if you're able to share or not, but can you share about the likelihood, based on your experience, the clients you've had, the likelihood of that first initial renewal to the second portion being successful? Is it commonly a successful process?
I think so, but it doesn't exist that long yet. We haven't seen so many renewals yet. I mean, 30 years is a long time.
Yeah. Also, it's recent. Leasing like this is recent.
I mean, a lot of 30-year leases are expiring soon, mm-hmm. right? But I would say it's common that owners cooperate and they then the leases, are renewed properly. But it's not guaranteed.
Okay, just asking a little bit because you mentioned the word owner cooperation. So we're moving on to the actual owning the land itself. Are there any common instances of the owner and the lessor coming into legal conflict during the 30-year lease period, or are they usually just separate and they get along just fine?
Yes, that could be. That could happen, yes.
Okay. But I guess you're saying it could happen, meaning you haven't really encountered any cases of this happening?
Not often. No, I would not say so. The renewal, that's the time where things get problematic. You can get problematic, and during the 30-year lease term, the lessee has the full right to possess and to use the property, and there should be no problems with that.
Okay. Okay, so we've talked about the lease itself, lease renewal, lease transfers, all the things to be aware of. So let's move on to me actually enjoying my property. So, but first of all, let's talk about once I am the owner of this lease agreement and I'm utilizing this land and home here, what are some legal and financial responsibilities that I have while owning the property, whether it's fees or property taxes or any other fees that I need to know of?
Apart from the utility that you have to pay, mostly that the new owner have to take care of the financial responsibility is the common area fees and the property tax. And property tax under the new law will appraisal by the competent authority. They will post the appraisal value to the property, and then you aware the number, and then you pay the tax.
Okay, so you are obligated to pay property tax each year on it. Now, when you say common area maintenance fees, for me, usually I think of condos. So when would you pay common area fees with a house? If it's in a Muban village?
Yeah, in Muban village or in the development project.
Okay.
Whether it's the subject to the proper development or not, and the owner have to pay anyway with the common area fees, like for the access road, for the lighting, or water supply, or whatever.
Okay. So I need to pay utilities, obviously water, electricity. Obviously, if I get internet, I pay that. Property tax each year. And also, if I am in a property project like a village or a Muban, I'm subject to whatever fees that they have. And that would vary depending on each project, right? What they will state. Okay. Okay, so now that we've got that out of the way, let's talk about what are some ways that I can utilize my property. So we mentioned that if I leased an empty plot of land, I have the right to build a structure on it. Can this only be a house? Can I build a factory, a hotel, or what are my limitations and freedoms in what can I build on this land?
What you can build on this land, we have to check the building, city planning law. Okay. That will designate as the purpose of the land. We have to check what kind of the zone of the land plot is, and the city planning law will fix whether it's that purpose for residential. If it is purpose for residential, you just build only the house. If in case of the commercial, for sure that you can build the hotel or the department store. I think it depends on the city planning law.
Okay, so that depends on the zoning. Okay.
Yes, right, and then you would apply for a building permit, obviously.
Okay.
So we can advise on what on general terms or the legal the framework, and then the architect would typically apply for the building permit, and the architects, they're experts on these kind of applications.
Yeah, I think I'm assuming if I had a vision of wanting to build a factory, we would be discussing this in advance and be looking at a zoning, a place that has the appropriate zoning. But let's say we step back to buying back to my holiday beachfront property in Phuket. What else could I potentially do with this residential home? And would I be able to sublet this property to someone else to rent it on a monthly basis, and I generate income from it? Is this possible as well?
In case that you lease the land, right?
Yes. If I'm leasing the land, can I sublet it to someone else to rent the house, for example, on a monthly basis or a year contract?
That depends on the lease agreement with the landlord. In case the landlord allows the lessee to sublease the property, of course you can sublet that without any issue.
Okay. So it's important to note that also in Thailand you have building restrictions, right? A lot of people are not aware of that. They go to Samui, for example, and they think they can just build whatever they want, but that's not the case. There's this city planning for Samui Island, right? And you can build in certain places and others you're not allowed to, and there's height restrictions, and everything that we're used to from the Western countries exists here as well.
Okay. Yeah, I don't really want to get too much into commercial because today we're talking mostly about residential, but I do kind of want to talk a little bit about running some kind of a business there. Let's say, for example, I live in my Phuket villa, and let's say I want to make it my home office for, let's say, my company. Let's say I'm a digital nomad, I do online stuff, and I just register it as my home office. Is something like this possible and common?
That's kind of thing depends on the building permit. In case of you build the structure, building structure, you need to apply building permit, and we have to state to the authority what kind of the building is. Is that for residential? Is that for the office? Or is that hotel? Or is that for the commercial?
Yes, but that would be commercial use. Whether having a study room where you have a laptop and
yes,
that might not be under the scope of these laws.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So we've gone through the process of acquiring it. We talked about the legal structures, leasing the land and owning the structure itself. We talked about the lease renewals. We talked about the financial obligations, utilities and maintenance fees and taxes. Talked about different ways you can utilize the landed property depending on the zoning laws. Is there anything that I may be missing out in terms of the scope of how much you can utilize the property?
I just wanted to add that except leasehold, there's maybe other legal structures that should be mentioned as well. If you, for example, a lot of foreigners here have family and they're married to Thai nationals, then it's possible to transfer, to have the land, the property owned by the Thai spouse, and for example for the foreign spouse register for a lease, for example, or maybe a so-called usufruct, which is a very similar property right compared to similar to the leasehold. It can be a lifelong right. It can be registered like that. And then you could, if you have children, you could will the property to your children, right? This way you can find a good legal structure for every case, right? There's in the past people have set up. If you, let's say, if you run a business and you do commercial, you buy property for commercial purposes, right? And then if you have a company, a Thai company together with Thai partners, this is something that is also very common, that this kind of company would invest in property as for a warehouse or for a business like hospitality or something like that, or a restaurant. That is all very common. We should mention that as well. That has nothing to do with leasehold. If in this kind of case, companies that are promoted by the Board of Investment also have the possibility, if they are granted this privilege by the BOI, then to own land and to own property. So there's sort of a variety of structures that need to be discussed, right? And the leasehold is one of them. There are structures as well where you have a commercial where developments, let's say smaller housing developments where they would lease property to foreigners and then also offer commercial interest in the land holding company. These legal structures may be a bit debatable, but they exist, right? I'm just mentioning them here. There's sort of a dispute whether they are legal or not. But it's a wide range of structures, and it also depends what you offer, right? From what the seller offers you.
Right. You mentioned joint ownership with the spouse. So actually, let's stay on that topic for a little bit, because I think a lot of people will be curious about this as well. So I think generally, I'm not married, so the questions are not in my head. I'm just trying to think. So I think for me, there's two main scenarios. The first scenario is, let's say I'm single right now and I'm leasing the property, leasing the land, and owning the structure. If I get married, would there be the option to have my wife purchase the land and then I own the building on top of it? Is that something that's possible and or common?
Yes, that's actually there's no law suspend that kind of the legal structure. In case of the foreigner, they just married with the Thai wife, and the land office aware that the Thai wife has marriage registration with the foreigner. What the land office will do, they will ask the Thai wife to sign a confirmation letter between the husband and wife to confirm that the money that the Thai wife purchased the land is the private property. It's not the common property, which means the land plot will be the sole owner of the Thai wife.
Okay.
And for of course the structure, we can split that. The foreigner own the structure of the house, but they did some dispute with the land office. They will treat it like a circumvention that the wife like a issue of the nominee. Sometimes that happen with the land office.
Okay. So just to summarize, so yes, the Thai wife has the option to purchase the property. Obviously, it depends on whether the owner wants to sell it. But then when the Thai wife in purchasing this, they will need to verify that it's the wife's personal funds, and they will have sole ownership of so on the title deed, it will only be the wife's or husband's, the Thai husband or Thai wife's name, Thai spouse's name, exactly. Right? So you can't have a joint ownership of the land. It can only be the Thai spouse. Now, as for the structure, can it be a joint ownership of the structure?
That's possible to register as the joint ownership of the structure. Okay. But what we set up the legal structure before, there have to be connection between the land and house. What we did before, we register the usufruct, that like a connection between the land plot and the structure, like allow the foreigner entitled with the enjoyment of the land plot.
Okay.
If I so we have discussed these kind of things very often and very much in detail, and at one point we decided to go to the land office to talk to the officer and say, look, we are a law firm here. We are advising foreigners in legal matters and property law matters. What according to you, in your opinion, what should we advise a foreigner who has a family here in Thailand, who is married with a Thai, they have children together and so on? What should we tell them? What do you think? What would you tell them? And what they answered was the best way to structure the property ownership is to have the ownership of the land and the house in the Thai spouse's name. And for the foreign spouse, assuming that the foreigner is the one, or partly at least pays the purchase price. The foreign spouse would be the beneficiary of a usufruct. That means a lifelong possession and usage or use right. And they would both then have the possibility to own and to use and to possess the property. And for the children, they recommended us to set up a joint will for the benefit of their children. That means in practice you don't have ownership, but the foreigner who has also invested his money into this property would have for the rest of his life the possibility to use the property together with his family, but to use the property and to possess it. And when he passes, the property, it would be ensured that it goes to his children. Right? So you kind of have created a situation that is essentially, as a result, very similar to ownership. It's not ownership, but in practice, it's something that works. And we thought that this is a good structure, and we've recommended it to many clients.
Okay, so you would say this is the standard structure that the land office has recommended, and therefore it is what you would recommend as well. Would it be that?
I'm not sure whether it's a standard, but it was recommended by the land office.
Okay,
yeah.
Great, understood. So that's great. So we talked about joint ownership with a Thai spouse. Now I just want to ask a little bit about the consistency of Thailand's laws, because a lot of comments I get from some people are skeptical about investing so much money into this because they think as foreigners their property ownership rights may not always be honored. So we know that that's not the case, but just to give a definitive answer, have Thai property laws changed a lot, or have they remained mostly the same throughout the country's history?
Okay, if I can answer that question. Property law is one of the fields of law where the laws usually don't change often. Other areas of law, like tax law, there's constant changes, many times every year, and tax lawyers need to stay up to date with all the changes, etc. Property law maybe has not changed significantly in the last 50 years at all, and this is not only in Thailand, this is in all countries, it's typical. I would say normally there should not be changes with regards to foreigners. A lot of people always talk about potential changes that might happen soon, and then there's another discussion about when is the Thai government going to relax the rules for foreigners. I'm here since 16 years now, and I have not seen any changes. There's a lot of discussion, but it's usually discussions in the foreigner communities, and not really actually in the lawmakers. There has not been any movement at all. They introduced a new property right called sublet that maybe was targeted to help foreigners, but it did not become a game changer.
When was this?
When was this? 4 or 5 years ago?
4 or 5.
Like roughly a few years ago.
Yes, a few years ago.
How do you say it in Thai?
In Thai called sublet.
Sublet. Okay.
Yeah.
So it was a new kind of amendment, but it didn't really go anywhere. Is it worth mentioning at all, really?
Announced at the land office, but still have an issue.
Have not issued.
Have an issue because the land office, most of them they never did that before, and they will avoid any mistake.
Okay.
I believe most of them they will refuse to do that now at the moment.
It is probably more academic at the moment, and in practice it did not really have an impact. It's a property right that is comparable to the lease or to the usufruct, but it will not. It did not bring any substantial new rights.
So the answer basically is property rights haven't really changed. neither negative or positive. They've just been basically the same for all these years.
Yeah, we cannot predict the future, but typically property laws don't change.
Yeah, I think the reason why a lot of people in the expat community have this sense of skepticism about property laws changing, I think there's two reasons. Is number one, because they're so focused on visas, because visa laws change, rules change all the time. So they think visa changes all the time. Oh, I'm so afraid of property laws changing, but that's not the case. And number two, I think as a lot of Westerners looking at Thailand with all these numerous military takeovers of elected governments, right? So they might be afraid that, oh, what if the military nationalizes the private sector or something like that. But so far in Thailand's history of many military takeovers, it hasn't affected Thai property law, really.
No, it hasn't, and it also hasn't affected foreigner laws that are related to foreigners. It would these kind of things would also make a very they probably are careful to make changes there because such changes would have a big impact on the economy.
Yep. Just very quickly, to touch upon, so I think a lot of people will, if we didn't talk about this, a lot of people will ask about what are your thoughts on the proposed amendments to property laws for certain special visas that were just approved by the cabinet, right? Is this something that someone who's looking into property should be leaning into, or do you think don't focus on this yet?
Yeah, this is very recent news, and it's not. We don't have the letter of the law yet. It's not in effect yet. These new rules. That's why, unfortunately, we cannot say much. We cannot give much meaningful advice there. Maybe by November we will know more. So it's definitely worthwhile to follow the news. But I would not have, I would be careful with having too high expectations.
Right. But and even if there was more details, based on what we know now, it would be for mostly highly wealthy foreigners, so it would not be for everyone. And also, what do you think is maybe the motivation in principle of why they're introducing this? Would you be able to comment on that? Just to give special ownership privileges?
They said that they would like to have wealthy individuals coming to Thailand and spending money here, investing here, and that seems to be the motivation.
Okay, but still, nothing really clear yet. It might take a long time. It might not happen, or it could happen. So it's just not something to focus on right now.
I understand that these new laws, if they come before they take effect, they will also still require certain approvals from certain government agencies. So we're hoping that there will be relaxations and new possibilities for foreigners. But I personally would be careful and just wait and see first.
Sure. And if there's more details, we can do a follow-up interview on this in the future as well.
Yes.
Yeah. So this has been a really great comprehensive interview. So let's actually wrap this up with the final section. Is now we've talked about acquiring the property and ways I can utilize it and my rights and obligations with whether myself or with my Thai spouse. I can potentially sublet it depending on the agreement. Now, let's talk about what happens if I want to sell the property. So how does the process of selling, well, not selling the property, it would be selling the lease. Would that be a correct way to say it?
Okay, generally speaking, I would say that generally a subletting is not restricted. For a long-term lease, you should be able to sublet the property without limitations. I mean, otherwise, a contract that would say otherwise, I think, would be very problematic. So you shouldn't accept it. When you sell the property, if it's freehold, it's a straightforward process. If it's a leasehold, 30-year long-term lease that we discussed before, then it's more complicated. Then you have to do this novation agreement, you have to register the new lessee, and you need to do this registration at the land office. But it's all doable.
Now, do I have to ask the owner for permission to sell my lease agreement, or do they not? Or is that not an issue?
You need that unless you have a contract where this is already, stipulated otherwise.
Okay. So let's say I've leased it for 10 years now, right? And now I want to sell it for whatever reason, let's say to my other foreign friend. So you say that you may need permission to do that unless it's stipulated in the lease agreement. Okay, so let's say we're able to do it. Can you walk us through the process of me selling the lease agreement to my other foreign friend, let's say?
From the perspective of the new lessee or the buyer, and from the perspective of the buyer, it's not that different. The process will be very similar. It's just a different kind of contract. The buyer would do the due diligence as well. There would be contract negotiations as well. There would be a registration at the land office. For lawyers, it's a completely different thing, but with a more practical approach, it might be not so different at all.
Okay, so when selling it, do I incur also capital gains tax in case I sell it for a profit?
Capital gains tax doesn't exist as such in Thailand.
Okay.
But capital gains are taxed as income, so it's part of the personal income or the corporate income.
Okay.
So with regards to property, you would have capital gains when you resell for a profit, or if you rent out the property. That would be situations where you have to maybe get tax advice and where you have to file a tax return and so on.
Okay. Anything to add about selling the property? I know it's a process that's well into the future for a lot of people. They may not think of it, but is there anything that we should be aware of that
Another thing that we should aware of is the utility, like electricity. Maybe the last thing that the seller have to aware of, like transfer the utilities to the buyer.
Okay.
Water and electricity.
Yeah. Okay. So let's say we've successfully sold it. I have my money now. And can you talk a little bit of repatriating it back into my home country, let's say?
Okay, there's not that much to say about it. Transferring money out of Thailand is usually a bit more difficult than transferring money into Thailand. You will have certain reporting requirements, right? The commercial bank has to report to the Bank of Thailand. So they will ask you for documentation. Where did the money come from? And why is it transferred out of Thailand? Where did it come from initially? Is it the proceeds of doing business here, or was it transferred from overseas to Thailand initially? So you have to show contracts, you have to show bank transfer documentation and so on to show clearly what is going on with this money and why it is transferred out of Thailand.
Okay. This was such a comprehensive session here. I really appreciate your time. We went from the very beginning of acquiring, owning, and selling. You've been so detailed, both of you. I think to the point where I've learned so much here, and it's been, I think a lot of people will gain a lot of value from this as well, because I think this really is a topic in Thai property that so many people want to know about. I mentioned in the beginning that a lot of people don't want to move from their Western condo to live in another condo. When they think of Thailand, they think of a beach and a house and a place to raise their family. And however, the process of doing that is quite complicated and nuanced. And I feel that I really hope that this video, this interview session is going to be very valuable. And obviously, I'm going to link to your contact details in the description of this video for anyone to reach out and ask for your expertise as well. So I really appreciate the time that both of you have provided me in this interview and really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure.
You're welcome.
Thank you.